Hey everyone, my name is Audrey Vandycastle. I am an artist and maker here in Baltimore City, and I actually run the Stanley Black & Decker Makerspace up in Towson. Today I'm going to be showing you guys our Metal Shop 1 safety class, teaching you how to use some of the tools here in the shop and hopefully get you prepped to take some next level classes after that. Metal Shop safety covers bandsaws, drill presses, and some of our hand tools. We have a lot of other tools here in the shop as well, including our MIG welders, TIG welders, CNC plasma cutters, and sheet metal tools. Before we get started on the equipment in the shop, I want to cover a little bit of your basic safety when coming into the metal shop here at OpenWorks. You always want to wear eye protection, whether it's side shields like this, regular safety glasses, or safety goggles. We even have some face shields over by the angle grinders. Hearing protection is really important in this shop. Tools can get really loud here. There's also face masks that you should always be wearing while you're in the shop. Towards the front of the shop is a sanitation station. Always make sure you're washing your hands frequently. There's hand sanitizer there, as well as disinfectant and paper towels for you to clean your space. One of the most versatile tools in this shop is the horizontal bandsaw. It's a really great saw for cutting material or even multiple pieces of material at once, as long as they're properly clamped in the vise of the machine. So what's really great about this machine is it does a lot of the work for you. So the weight of the head of the machine is actually going to help the cut happen. And we'll discuss a little bit how to control and make sure your piece is safely locked in the machine, as well as having coolant flowing to keep it cool and not dull the blade. All right, so we can see here that this head of the machine is on a pivot, and you can see it's going to come down very slowly. So we have full control over the speed that the machine is going to be able to lower. And that's controlled in two ways right here with this hydraulic feed. I can close the hydraulic valve entirely by using this little lever right here, and you can see the motion of the arm of the machine has stopped. If I open it up, I then have some fine control over the speed with this thumb dial right here. You can see on top of the dial that there are numbers, and I generally like to have my speed right around 2, maybe 3. You can see a nice slow feed. And what this is going to do is it's going to make sure that the blade doesn't dull as you're cutting. I'm going to go ahead and stop the motion right now because I want to show you a couple other switches on this machine. This machine does have integrated coolant, and we can see that the coolant is on because we have a toggle switch right here that's switched to on. This is the overall power for the machine, and when this coolant switch is on, when I turn the machine on, the coolant's going to begin flowing. We can see that there's a lever up top here as well, which is going to control the rate of speed of our coolant. So I'm going to go ahead and turn the machine on with no material in the vise so that you guys can see what that coolant looks like when it's flowing. If you think that there's not enough coolant flowing, you can use this little lever to go ahead and open up. And this is probably too much coolant in my opinion. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to slow that coolant down until it's just coating the blade. Right about there is probably acceptable. Okay, so now that I've gotten and made sure that my coolant is flowing at a good rate, and I've stopped the motion of the saw, I'm ready to go ahead and load in my piece. It's really important that your piece is always clamped in this vise right here while you're working, while you're making a cut. Otherwise, it's going to go flying across the room. Generally, this is set up for a straight cut. That means 90 degrees, right? But you can angle this vise if you need to make angled cuts. So this is a really nice way if you want to make 45s for welding or even a kooky angle. You're going to be able to achieve it with this, adjusting this vise right here. Now to open up the vise, I'm going to go ahead and use this handle here. You can see that I can back it off, and sometimes it'll need a little bit of encouragement to open. And now I've got a nice opening here. So if I was making a cut that I wanted to be exact, I could go ahead and mark where I wanted to cut the material. Otherwise, I'm going to make sure that it's nice and flat against the base of the machine, and I'm going to go ahead and close up the vise. And you want to make sure that the machine obviously is not running at this point, because you never want to be putting your hands anywhere near the blade while it's actually running. And what's great about this machine is that it allows your hands to be pretty much completely clear from the blade while it's actually operating. So you can see here, I'm going to give it a nice kind of firm tightness down with that handle to make sure that that vise is nice and solid. If you aren't sure, go ahead and give it the jiggle check. Make sure that nothing's moving around in that vise. Once I've gotten my material secured, I can go ahead and use my sight from above to make sure that it's lined up with the mark that I want to cut on the actual piece of material. If that looks good, we can go ahead and do two things. One, we need to turn the machine on. And two, we need to make sure that we open up this movement lever right here. So I'm going to turn the machine on first. Again, check to make sure that that coolant is flowing. Coolant keeps your piece nice and cool and makes your cut clean, but it also protects the blade and the teeth on the blade, so it'll protect it from dulling. So now that I can see that my machine is operating, I'm going to go ahead and open up this finger, this lever right here, and you can see that the machine's going to be falling. If you think that this is still going too fast, once it comes into contact with the surface of the material, you can put a hand right here on the machine to help alleviate some of the weight and slow it down. Or again, you can adjust this thumb screw right here to keep that speed nice and slow. We want to prevent any teeth from falling off the blade here. So you can see it's slowly approaching the surface of the material. And it will begin the cut. And you'll actually notice that the machine has turned itself off. That's one of my favorite things about horizontal bandsaws, is they have a little foot here that's going to hit that lever. So once it clears the bottom of the cut, it's actually going to hit that lever with that foot and turn the machine off. That's really awesome. You never want to walk away from this machine while you're cutting. You never know what could go wrong. It's always good to keep an eye on any machine that you're using here and be present while it's operating. Even though you don't have to be actively touching it, you still want to keep an eye on it. Now that I've completed my cut, I need to retrieve my material from the vise. So I can do that just by simply loosening this handle again. And now this vise is loose and I can pull out my piece. It is important to make sure that you clean the space after you've used it. So if this is your last cut, go ahead and take a chip brush and clean off anything that might be in where the vise clamps. And if you got any coolant on the floor, go ahead and wipe that up as well, because that could be a fall hazard for somebody else coming in to use the shop after you. This machine is called a cold saw. This is good for making really clean and precise cuts. And the reason that it's called a cold saw is because it has coolant that's fed along the blade, which keeps your part nice and cool while you're cutting. The one downside to this machine is that it does take a pretty long time. So make sure that you're cutting something less than an inch thick if you're cutting solid material with this saw. So when we're using this saw, you always want to make sure that your piece is nice and tight in the vise. And you can also notice that I put on hearing protection for this saw. So eye protection is pretty much all the time in here. Hearing protection, because this saw can get pretty loud, so you want to make sure you either put on some hearing protection or earplugs in your ear. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to set my material in this vise, and you can see that this vise has a notch in it, which is going to make it a lot easier to hold your material without putting it flat on the bottom of the vise. So I'm going to center it roughly in this vise here, and it'll actually automatically center once I get tighter in there. And you want to make sure that your piece is at least as long as the vise when you're cutting in this part with this machine. Anything small, obviously you won't be able to clamp in the vise, so you can't cut it with this saw. You'll notice that this switch is pulled on. That means I can turn the machine on with a squeeze of this trigger right here. And you want to make sure when you're using this saw that you're not trying to force it through a cut. It's designed to do a job, and like I said, it can take a long time to do that job, so you just got to be patient when you're cutting with this saw. Really important that you turn the blade on before you come into contact with the material. So we're going to go ahead and try and make our cut right now. So you'll also notice that there's a guard on this saw, and this is going to automatically move out of the way as I lower the saw. So you don't need to worry about trying to adjust this. So I'm going to turn the machine on. You can see that the blade is operating, and I'm going to lower the saw. Once you feel that you've made it through the cut, you can go ahead and release the lever to make sure that the saw turns off, and then you can unclamp your material. Now this is a cold saw, so if we feel where our cut was, it's not really very warm to the touch like it might be on some of the other saws here in the shop, but always make sure that there could be sharp bits and burrs on here, so you want to be careful when you're touching freshly cut pieces of metal. This saw can also be angled, so if you need help angling it, go ahead and grab a shop tech and they can give you a hand doing that. Once you're finished with your cut, you want to make sure that you leave it in a decent shape for the person to come after you. So go ahead and remove any chips or debris that may be left in the vise or on the surface of the vise below where the cutting fluid comes. Machine that we're going to go over right now is called the Multicutter. Now this machine can cut a lot faster than the other cutting implements in the shop. It also is a lot louder and throws a lot more sparks. So you really want to make sure here that you're wearing eye protection and hearing protection. And if there's anyone else in the shop, you want to maybe give them a heads up as well, because they're going to want to put on hearing protection for this machine to operate. A couple things about this machine. This does have a guard as well, and this will move out of the way as we lower the machine. With any cutting implement here in the metal shop, you always want to make sure that the blade is operating before you're in contact with the material. And you want to make sure that your material is firmly clamped before you make any cuts on it. This machine is pretty nice because you can also angle your cuts. So again, if you want to make 45s here, you can do that. Simply pull up on this lever and that loosens the back guard, and you can adjust it to any of the preset angles that are on the back there. You also can really easily move this clamp quickly. So you can see that this little switch right here, when it's pulled up, you can easily move this back and forth. And when it's down, you're going to have to actually spiral it, right? And this will pivot to adjust with the angle that you set the back fence at. Whenever you're cutting a piece of material that's oblong or it's not square, you want to make sure that you're putting it in an orientation where the blade will have the most contact with the surface at once. So for a piece of material like this, I'm going to make sure that I put it flat in the vise instead of upright, because I'm less likely to wear on the teeth in that way. So what I want to do is put it flat here on the ground. This machine, it's not the best for super precise cuts, again, because it is kind of fast and dirty. But if you need to cut stuff really quickly or at a super precise angle, this might be the machine for you. So you can see that I've loosely put it in there. At this point, I would want to check to make sure that the blade was going to hit the mark that I made on my material if I made a precise mark. And you always want to make sure that you're accounting for that blade width when you're measuring on your parts as well. So now that I'm happy with where that piece of material is, I'm going to go ahead and tighten it down a little bit more, make sure that it's not going to move in my vise, and I'm getting pretty ready to make my cut. One other thing that you want to note here is you don't want to ever cut a piece of material that's shorter than this front part here, because it's not going to be able to hold it adequately. So you want to make sure that your material is long enough to cut on this piece of machine, or on this piece of equipment. And if it's not, there's lots of other ways to cut small material here in the shop. Just don't use this machine. Okay, so now that I've made sure that my piece is nice and secure in the bed of the machine, I can go ahead and grab this trigger handle right here. Again, I'm going to start the blade before I come in contact with the material, and then I'm just going to go straight down with it. All right, so you can see it's loud and it shoots sparks, but boy is it fast, right? So we got a really fast cut with that, and it's pretty clean. You can see that there's a slight burr on the back side of it, but it's a really good machine for a fast and a dirty cut. Okay, so this machine is called a vertical bandsaw. What's nice about this machine is that you can use it to cut freehand, and you can see that it's got a really thin blade on it with a lot of fine teeth. So that means we're going to be able to make nice curves with this bandsaw. But it also means that it's not really capable of cutting super thick material. So depending on what type of material you're cutting, you can only go up to 14 gauge for mild steel, 18 gauge, I believe, for stainless steel, and then about 1/8 of an inch for aluminum. There are some metals that aren't allowed here in this shop, and those are zinc-plated metals, painted metals, or rusty metals. If you aren't sure what type of material you have, there's a couple easy ways to tell. Number one, aluminum is going to be a lot lighter than any of the steels you might be working with. It's also generally a really bright silver color like this. Another surefire way to tell if something's aluminum versus mild steel or stainless steel is stick a magnet to it. If it's not magnetic, chances are it's aluminum. If you aren't sure what type of material you have, feel free to ask someone else in the shop or a shop tech, and they can help you identify your material before you do any work on it. Now let's talk a little bit about safety with the bandsaw. You want to make sure that you're always wearing eye protection here in the shop, and if you're cutting some really thin sheet, you generally want to put on hearing protection as well because it can get kind of loud. Another good thing to make sure of here with a bandsaw is that you're not wearing gloves when you use a bandsaw. When you're using gloves with a bandsaw, it can be really easy to get the tip of a glove or something like that stuck in the blade, which can be really dangerous and actually cause you harm. So you want to make sure that you're being safe. Pull back your hair, roll up your sleeves if you have anything that's dangling. You don't want to be able to get it anywhere near the action here with the bandsaw blade. It's also important that you're not using this to cut tiny materials. And my general rule of thumb is if it's smaller than this circle here, it's probably too small for you to try and cut on this bandsaw. You don't want your fingers to be in there close by the blade of the bandsaw, especially when it's operating. Something might slip and your hand could go right into the blade. So be careful with this machine. One of the really great safety features on this machine is called the blade guard right here. And I can adjust that by grabbing the knob on the back of the machine and loosening it. So if I loosen that knob, you can see that this can move up and down. And a general rule of thumb for where to set the height of your blade guard is about 1/8 of an inch above your material. So have your material in there, obviously when the machine is off, take a look with your eyeballs and see about 1/8 of an inch. And that's a safe distance for your blade guard above the piece of work for this 1/8 inch piece of aluminum. Now what I'm gonna do here is I'm just gonna cut a corner off, and you'll be able to see this is a nice machine for cutting pieces of aluminum and thin pieces of metal like steel. Like with any bandsaw that you're using here in the shop, you want to make sure that the blade is fully in motion before you try and put any material into it. And you also want to make sure that your feet, generally about shoulder width apart, if you're pushing into the bandsaw like this, you're putting way too much pressure into it, and once you finish your cut, you might actually lose your balance and fall into the machine. So a nice even stance is really important when using this vertical bandsaw. Here's some helpful tips if you're trying to make a curved cut on a bandsaw. There's a cut called a relief cut. So let's say I'm trying to cut along a very tight arc or even a semicircle or full circle. I probably won't be able to manipulate the material to make that tight cut in one go. So you can make what's called a relief cut, which are making multiple straight cuts that approach the arc that you want to make. So you'll come in with the bandsaw and make a straight cut. But one thing to be sure of is that you're never backing out of a cut on the bandsaw. So you can use these relief cuts to kind of come in and approach your curved line, but you would want to make sure that you turn the machine completely off before you try and back out of the cut. So if the blade is engaged with the material and you're done cutting, turn the machine off before you try and remove the material from the blade. Now that I've set my blade guard and I've prepared my material, I'm going to go ahead and turn the bandsaw on. Again, make sure that nothing's resting against the blade when you hit on here. Here's the on button. You can hear it start up. Now I'm going to go ahead and make my cut by putting light pressure on my piece right against the blade there. And you again want to be careful of where you're putting your hands here. If you need, you can get a push stick to help you with your cut. Once you've finished with your cut, you want to make sure that you turn off the blade and that it comes to a complete stop before you try and retrieve any material that's sitting right next to the blade. Also remember that if you have material that is an offcut from your material, chances are that it's really hot. So if you see a piece of material in there, it is a good idea to get it out of the way, but you want to make sure that number one, the blade is off and you're using a tool like this chip brush to get it out of the way instead of touching it with your bare fingers because it could burn you. Let's talk about the drill press. This is a really great machine for drilling holes in lots of different types of metals, but you want to make sure that you're being safe with this machine. A couple things to keep in mind are that chips can go flying with this machine. So safety protection, eye protection is a must with this machine. Also, this spindle right here can spin pretty fast. So you want to make sure that your hair's pulled back, you're not wearing anything dangly like a necklace or jewelry, and if you have long sleeves, go ahead and pull them up. This is another machine that we probably don't want to be wearing gloves with as well, because we don't want anything that could get caught in the spindle, which is this part right here. Also, when the machine is operating, you're going to never want to touch this. You should keep your hands away from this at all times. And one of the things that's going to help you with that is that we've got a couple different devices here on the bed of the table to be able to clamp our material. When you're using a drill press, unless you're using something that's giant and heavy that you're drilling into, you want to make sure you're either using this vise right here to clamp your material and hold it to the table. That way you can keep your hands nice and safe out of the way, or you're using these clamps here to clamp your material down to the table. It's also good practice to use a spoil board or something like that under your drill bit so you aren't making these nice holes that you see here on the vise. You can also put a plate down here or a piece of wood, something that's going to help protect the bed of the table. If you need to adjust the height of the machine, there are some cam locks and levers over here where you can unlock this collar right here and then use this crank to lower or raise the bed. If you're having trouble with this, go ahead and grab a shop tech and they can help you adjust the height of the bed. When you're ready to make a hole with the drill press, the first thing you're going to need to do is load your drill bit in. So to do that, we can simply use our hand to adjust the teeth of the drill bit here, of the spindle right here. So you can see one direction, those teeth are going to open up. The other direction, they're going to close and tighten. So what we're doing right now is just going to make sure that we're opening this up enough to slide this drill bit into. You want to make sure you're not opening it up too much, and we're just going to go ahead and tighten it by hand, just to see if that feels good. If you get wiggle or something in there, you maybe want to tighten it a little bit more. Now you can see there are some geared teeth around here, as well as a hole, and there's a couple holes on each side of the spindle. And that's for something called the chuck key. Chuck key is very important because once you get your drill bit nice and tightened, you're going to want to go ahead and tighten it up even further with the chuck key. You also want to note that when you're inserting your drill bit, you don't want to put the piece with the flutes into where the teeth are. You want to keep the teeth right on that rounded part of the shaft of the drill bit, because if you put it where the flutes are, you're not going to get a very strong or straight grip on this drill bit, which will make our drill very hard to do. So once I've gotten my bit most of the way in, I'm going to go ahead and take my chuck key, and you can see that those little notches on the chuck key are actually going to line up perfectly with those teeth on the spindle. And I'm going to go ahead and tighten to the best of my ability with that chuck key. So it's important to make sure you get it nice and tight because, again, this does have a pretty powerful motor attached to it. So if it's not tightened with the chuck key, your drill bit might come loose as you're drilling. So I'm going to go ahead and tighten it up a couple times just to make sure. And then I'm going to make sure I put the chuck key right back in this holder because I don't want to lose it for when I need to use it again or when someone else in the shop needs to use it. So now that we've got our drill bit drilled up, we're ready to prep our material. So now that my drill bit's in the spindle, I'm ready to prep where I want my hole to be on my material. So I'm going to take a punch like this, and I'm going to find the point that I want the drill bit to go into, and I'm just going to give it a light tap with the hammer. And what that does is it makes it, it gives it a little pilot hole almost, a little dent that the drill bit will be able to find center on, so that way your drill bit isn't walking around on the surface or getting twisted or angled before it starts drilling. The next thing we want to do is we're going to load our piece into our vise. And we'll go ahead and tighten it up. You want to make sure that your piece is nice and tight in that vise because you don't want it to go flying. One good rule of thumb also to remember is that the bulk of the length of your material should be on the left-hand side of the vise. And the reason for that is the spindle rotation is clockwise. So that means if for some reason you were to slip or lose grip on your material, it would send the material that way away from you, as opposed to if your material was here, it would come and it would hit you, right? So you want to make sure that the bulk of your material is to the left-hand side of the drill press there. Now we can use these handles right here on the side of the drill press to lower the drill bit to get a good look and see if my piece is lined up with that nice pilot hole that I made with that punch. And that looks pretty close to me. And if I want, I can also turn on the light with that front button here so I can get a little bit better view of what's going on. So once you have your material lined up with your drill bit, we're almost ready to start drilling. Before we're ready to start drilling, I want to grab a little bit of oil and go ahead and put some on the surface right there of your material, or you can drip it right on the drill bit itself. And you want to make sure you clear this off the table after you've done that. Just like with the saws here in the shop, you want to make sure that you start that drill bit before you actually start lowering it and coming in contact with the material. So I'm going to hit this big green button to turn my drill bit on. And then I'm going to make sure I have a nice grip on the vise so that it doesn't go flying while I'm drilling. And then slowly but surely, I can lower it. One good thing to do here is to just do a quick visual check. If your drill bit looks nice and straight, you can go ahead and continue with the hole. If it looks like when you take a pencil and you make the pencil look like rubber, it looks like it's curving or something like that, you maybe want to take it out and make sure that the drill bit's nice and straight in the spindle. If it doesn't look straight while it's spinning, chances are it's in the teeth crooked in the spindle. So I'm going to go ahead and lower very slightly, and I'm just going to be putting minimal pressure here. It can be really easy to bend the handles of this, so you want to make sure you're just lightly putting pressure on those handles. Once you've gone through, go ahead and back out, and then turn the material or turn the spindle off. And you can see with the shavings that I have coming off of this, they're nice and spiral, right? That means that my drill bit is very sharp, which is a good thing because it was super easy to drill that hole. If you're having problems drilling the hole, or you feel like you need to put a lot of pressure on it, or your drill shavings look like little tiny flakes, chances are that your drill bit is dull, and you should go ahead and try and find a sharper bit to make your hole. Once you've finished with that, if you have any more holes to do, you can go ahead and do them. Otherwise, free your material from the vise, go ahead and clean off the surface, and then take a chip brush and brush off the surface of the bed as well to leave it nice for the person that's coming behind you. So to clean off my surface, I'm just going to go ahead and brush it off with my brush here, and then I'm going to go ahead and clean out any debris that may have gotten in the way of the vise so that I have a nice smooth surface for the vise. The last thing you want to do to finish up your cleaning your workstation is remove that bit from the spindle. Go ahead and take your chuck key to loosen it, and you should be able to slide it right out. Make sure you return the chuck key. The next machine I'm going to show you is called the disc sander. This is a really good way, a nice stationary machine for you to go ahead and get rid of some burrs that may happen when you're cutting your material, or to go ahead and angle or round out corners of pieces of material that you may have cut. This machine can get loud, so make sure you grab some hearing protection if you're using this machine for a long time, and it also generates a lot of dust. So a dust mask or a respirator is a really good idea when you're using this machine. Occasionally you'll see some sparks with this machine, but it's generally nothing too crazy. If we look at the side of the machine, we'll see an on switch, and we'll also see something that I think is a good reminder. It has a directional arrow. So this shows us which way the disc is going to be spinning. It's always good to keep that in mind whenever you're using a sander. So when I'm ready to start working on this machine, there's a couple things to keep in mind. Number one, your material is going to heat up when you're using this machine. So if you're using a piece of aluminum, that heat's going to travel really fast. You may want to grab some leather gloves, as long as you're far enough away from the material that your fingers aren't going to get close to that belt sander, or I'm sorry, to that disc sander. General rule of thumb, try not to get anywhere close to that disc sander, right? With the abrasive that's on here, it can suck stuff down into it, so you want to make sure before you start using it that this is nice and close to the surface of that disc sander. If there's a large gap here, go get a shop tech, because number one, your part could get pulled down into there, which could cause the machine damage or to stall out, or your finger or something like that could get stuck in there, which could cause damage to you. So you always want to check to make sure that your surface is clean and nice and close to that disc before you go ahead and start working on this machine. Now you can see that half of the disc is blocked off, and that has something to do with that rotational direction again. This side's blocked off because when the disc is coming around here, it's actually shooting up. So if you were to lose control of your material, it would go flying up in the air or towards you. When we're using it on this side of the machine, the left side, all the force is going down, so it's going to help us keep our piece nice and tight down to the table. Always, always, always keep your piece flat on the table when you're using this machine. You don't ever want to be going like this or holding it up in the air. It'll probably slam it down anyway, but you don't want to give it any options to do that. So we're going to keep our piece nice and flat on the table. You can bevel this table, so if you need to get a different angle, instead of holding it up in the air, you can certainly just bevel the table to reach that angle that you need. Go ahead and grab a shop tech if you want to bevel the table on this machine. Just like the other machines we've used, when we turn the machine on, we want to make sure that the disc gets up to full speed before we put any material against it. And we want to make sure that we're just using light pressure. We want to let the machine do the work for us here. We don't need to be putting a ton of pressure into here because number one, it could slow the motor down on the machine and cause it damage, or we can actually rip through this adhesive, sticky abrasive disc here. So just a nice even pressure here is good. And it's generally a good idea to move back and forth across the disc so that you get even wear when you're using this machine. So I'm going to make sure my material is nowhere near the disc, and I'm going to go ahead and turn it on. I'm going to wait for it to get up to speed, and then I'm going to just very gently take and put my piece against that disc here. You can see there's minimal spark, but I'm able to very nicely get a nice rounded corner on this piece of material. Nice and smooth. And you can tell that I'm keeping it nice and flat to the surface and letting it do the work for me. And now we have a nice rounded corner on my metal. When you're done with the sander, go ahead and turn it off. Make sure that it slows down. If you needed to grab anything that was left, you would want to make sure that the disc was off before you grabbed it. This piece of equipment is called a belt sander. What's really great about this is you have kind of two working surfaces you can go from. There's one here, which has a flat plate, very similar to the disc sander that you saw. And then we also have a work surface up here. So this is going to allow us to get and sand in irregularly shaped, maybe we have a dip in our piece or something like that, or if you want to, smooth out a bevel or a curved cut you maybe have made on the bandsaw or with a drill press. Some really important things to keep in mind about this is that you shouldn't have anything dangly. Tie up your hair, no headphones here unless they're wireless, right? And ear protection, eye protection, and a face mask is always a good idea with this. It does generate a lot of dust that you don't want to breathe in. You also want to make sure that you're not going to put your hands anywhere where there could be any pinch points. So anywhere that the belt is kind of meeting the wheel or the face of the plate here, you want to make sure you're keeping your fingers away from it as well as your workpiece. There's some easy places to get pinched here, and this, and this wheel will all be spinning while we're using it. So you want to make sure that the area around you is clear and you're keeping your hands away from those points. Just like with the other equipment in the shop, when you turn it on, you want to let it get up to speed before you put any material against it. You don't want to ever have a material sitting against something and then you turn it on, because you never know what could happen or where it could end up across the shop when you do that. So to turn this on, there's a toggle switch right on the left-hand side of the machine. All I'm going to do is simply hit on, and you can see that it's powered on. Now I'll show you the two different ways you can use this machine. One is straight approach, so you can come just like with a disc sander. And again, you want to make sure you're moving across the belt so that you get even wear. It can be really easy to tear through these belts if you're just going in one location. So this is going to give us a nice, smooth, sanded surface on our machine, on our piece that we can control very nicely. And it goes nice and slow. It's not a very aggressive sander. So we can take off just a minimal amount of material at a time. This can be really good to prep edges if you're going to weld them. The next area that you can use is this area right here. So what we can do here is go ahead and approach it very cautiously, and again, make sure you have nothing dangling. And we can use this to just lightly sand any burrs or edges that may be on our material for when we cut it. Again, be very conscious of where your hands are here, and that this machine can certainly tear stuff out of your hands. So as much as you can keep your hands away and out of the line of fire, the better, right? So very nicely skimming the surface, we can do some nice light sanding here. When you're finished, go ahead and switch that off, and make sure it comes to a complete stop before you make any sudden movements around the machine here. So you can see this is a nice coarse abrasive. It's not too aggressive though. It's not something like an angle grinder that's going to take off a lot of material at once. So this can make your piece nice and smooth and nice and fine. Just like any machine here in the shop, you want to make sure you clean up when you're finished. So with the disc sander and the belt sander, go ahead and grab a broom and dustpan, sweep off any dust that may be left on the surface of the machine, as well as on the floor underneath. Accumulated dust here can be pretty slippery, so you want to make sure you make it nice and clean for people to follow behind you. Okay, so let's talk about my favorite tool, the angle grinder. The angle grinder is super versatile. It comes in cordless and corded types, and there's a ton of different attachments that you can put on them. First things first, let's talk about safety with an angle grinder. You should always wear eye protection with an angle grinder, hearing protection with an angle grinder, as well as face protection, right? These throw sparks pretty far, and they also can break in some disastrous ways, the accessories. So you want to make sure that you're protecting yourself to the best extent when you're using these machines. You also want to make sure that if there's anyone else in the shop around you, you're being respectful of their space. And you can make sure that you're directing those sparks somewhere that's not where a person is standing or where there's a nice sensitive piece of equipment like a lathe. So you always want to make sure that you're aware of the direction of those sparks on your angle grinder. One of the ways that you can help do that is by using this guard right here. This guard's pretty easy to move. I can adjust it by just pulling or pushing on this little lever right here, which is going to let me spin and adjust that guard. So if you find that that guard's in a spot that's not very helpful to where your sparks are going, simply slide it and adjust it around to protect yourself or others around you with sparks. It's really important that you make sure that sparks aren't coming and hitting you as well. If you have something like cotton on, it can actually burn the cotton or catch it on fire. And if you're wearing something like polyester, it'll actually melt that fabric right to your skin. So it's a good idea to make sure you're wearing non-synthetic materials when you're using an angle grinder, because again, those sparks are pretty much gonna be there whether you like it or not. So let's talk a little bit about the different types of attachments you can put on an angle grinder. I'll start with the most dangerous one, and that is the cutoff wheel. It's dangerous because of how thin it is, but it's also super useful. There are some use cases where the only way you're able to cut stuff is with this cutoff wheel. Generally, I will see if there is any other way for me to cut this material before I resort to a cutoff wheel, just because they are so dangerous. And the reason that they're dangerous is because when you're cutting, it's very easy to twist and shatter. And then these are going at 1200 RPM. They can get stuck in walls, in your safety glasses, or even in your person, right? So be really careful when you're using these, because you want to make sure that you're going nice and straight and you're not twisting or turning at all when you're using these. You also want to inspect these. If this isn't a brand new cutoff wheel and you're coming and you're going to grab an angle grinder that has a used cutoff wheel in it, there's a couple things you want to check for. Number one, go ahead and spin the wheel. Obviously there's no battery in this angle grinder right now. Spin the wheel and just observe for any sort of cracks. If you see a crack, throw it away. It's no use to you, right? The crack's gonna basically, as soon as you turn it on and have it come into contact with the material, that crack's gonna make the whole thing shatter. The other thing you wanna look for is observe the edge. If you see any big gouges or nicks in the edge, again, it's probably not something that you wanna maintain, just chuck it, right? This edge actually looks pretty decent, so I could probably reuse this cutoff wheel if I wanted to. These are an abrasive material, so they will get used up pretty quickly. They are pretty thin, so these might be something that you go through a lot of if you're using them. Again, anytime that you're using this cutoff wheel, make sure that you have this guard adjusted so that it's blocking where you are, because if this wheel goes flying off, any other direction than towards you is the better direction. So make sure that guard is protecting you when you're using a cutoff wheel. So if I was gonna use this angle grinder in this orientation, I would be using it like this so that that guard can protect me from the sparks, and in case this wheel breaks, it's not gonna come towards me. let's talk about the next type of wheel or accessory you can put on your angle grinder. This is called an abrasive or a stone wheel. What this is good for is for removing a lot of material quickly, but it's not going to give you the nicest finish. You can see that it's pretty coarse, so it's going to basically give you a pretty rough surface on your material, but it's going to be able to move stuff very quickly. Something like this is really useful if you're grinding down welds. So if you've got a big fat weld that you're practicing on and you want to smooth it down, start off with this grinding wheel. It's going to let you move a lot of material quickly, and then once you get close to the surface, you can switch to one of these other discs. Again, when you're using an abrasive grinding wheel like this, before you start using it, if you're using a used one, so something that's not brand spanking new like this, you want to go ahead and observe your wheel for any imperfections. If it's super small, go ahead and get rid of it. This one's pretty close to being on its last legs, right? You can see some of that fiberglass is exposed in here. I could probably use it a little bit more, but for our cases today, I'm going to switch it out and use this new one. The next step after this abrasive grinding wheel is something called a flat disc. Now these come in different grits, just like sandpaper for wood. The lower the number, the coarser the grit. So this one right here is an 80 grit. I think they can go up, all the way up to 240 or whatever you might want. So again, you can start low and then work your way up if you want a really smooth finish on your metal. So this is what a brand new one looks like, and this is what a used one looks like. This one's probably pretty close to the end of its life as well. So it's not going to be working as nicely as a fresh new grinding wheel would. Things to check for before you use it on here. Check the diameter. If you notice that it's pretty close to the diameter of the head of your angle grinder, it's probably not going to be super helpful for you. You can go ahead and change it out for a new one. Whenever you're using grinding discs like this, respiratory protection is really important. So if I'm grinding for more than 5 minutes, I'll definitely make sure I put on a respirator or something that's a little bit beefier than just a regular mask, because I don't want to breathe in those tiny pieces of metal particulate. Another great tool that you can use on an angle grinder is this sanding wheel. So this actually has a flexible rubber backer, and it's more of a sandpaper-like attachment that you put on top of that backer. And what's nice about this is it's a lot more flexible than these rigid type grinding discs. So you're going to be able to get a little bit more artsy and curved and get into weird or maybe dished shapes with an attachment like this than you would with one of these rigid attachments. So this is really going to be for finishing work, smoothing out, or making decorative designs on stuff. And again, you can get different grits of this abrasive. This one's an 80 grit, and again, these come in different levels of abrasive. The last ones that I'm going to show you guys are wire wheel attachments. So these are really just for removing rust, removing paint, which you probably shouldn't be doing in here. But they're also really good for shining the surface. So if you have something that you've welded and maybe it's a little bit discolored, or you've done some grinding with this super abrasive wheel and you want to smooth it out or make it a little bit more uniform, the wire wheel is going to be a really good option for you. One thing that I find with wire wheels is that they can make you turn into a little bit of a porcupine, right? So these little pieces of wire can actually fly off as you're using it. It can stick into you. So you want to make sure that you're definitely wearing face protection, like a face shield with this when you're using any of these wire wheel attachments. And you want to be sure that you're keeping the space around you clear, and you don't want to accidentally be throwing any of these wires towards someone that might be near you. Okay, so let's talk about how we change the discs on our angle grinders. Anytime you want to change a disc on an angle grinder, you want to make sure that it's either unplugged or the battery is removed from it. You never want to be messing with the head of an angle grinder when it could accidentally power on. So all of my angle grinders are unplugged or have no batteries in them, so I'm good to go ahead and work on them. Now on the back of each angle grinder is generally a button. Depending on the model, it might look like this or it might look like something else. What this is going to do is it's going to lock the spindle at a certain point. So you can see right now I can freely turn this disc with my hand, but if I press this in, there's a certain point where that's going to lock that spindle. So what that's going to allow me to do is if I keep that depressed, I can either take my hand and loosen that, or I can use a nice spanner wrench like this to go ahead and loosen that nut. Take it all the way off, and you can see that there's two sides to this nut. So there's one side that's flat, and there's one side with this raised ring around it. For a disc like this, I want to keep that flat side against the disc, so that raised ring is going to be pointing out towards me. So I can go ahead and take this disc off, and you can see the difference between these two discs. One's brand new and one is used, right? And now what we're going to do is take this brand new disc, and I'm going to slip it right over here. Now there are different size of arbors on angle grinders, and I can see with this new disc, when I put it on, it doesn't actually seat around this little lip that's right here. So what that tells me is that this is actually the wrong size arbor for this machine. So what I need to do is find a grinding disc with a larger arbor hole here, and you'll see that when I put it on here, it fits that shoulder really nicely. Now if I were to use this disc on this angle grinder, it wouldn't work very well and it would be pretty unsafe. So you want to make sure that you're getting one that fits the right arbor size for your angle grinder. Now this disc isn't very new, but we're still going to be able to work with it. So once you've got an angle grinder that fits that shoulder, go ahead and take your nut and we're going to screw it back on. Again, I'm just going to get it finger tight for now, and then I'm going to pick it up and use that button on the back to tighten it the rest of the way. Again, it's unplugged, so I can touch it with my bare hands, and you can tighten it if you want, or you can use one of these spanner wrenches to get in there and tighten it. The directionality of an angle grinder will actually help keep this tight as it's grinding, but you want to make sure before you use it a couple of things: that this isn't loose and that you can't wiggle the disc, right? So you can see this disc doesn't have any give on it. If you see that that disc is wiggling, it's probably not seated correctly on the arbor and it's not safe for you to use. I've put a nice fresh grinding wheel on this angle grinder, and now I'm ready to make my material ready for me to use it. Whenever you're using an angle grinder, if you're using something that's small and lightweight, like this piece of metal, you want to make sure that it is clamped either in a vise or with actual clamps to the surface of the table. You should never try and grind on something that's unclamped unless it's giant and it's something like a car or a really heavy table that you know isn't going to move. Angle grinders spin really fast, so they can really easily shoot stuff across the room, which might not hurt you, but it may hurt a piece of equipment or someone else that's in the room. So now I'm ready to put my material in the vise. Always keep your work clamped when you're going to use it on an angle grinder. So I'm going to just tighten my piece up in this vise, and I'm going to orient it in a way so that the surface that I want to work on, which is this angled piece right here, is easy to get to. So go ahead and tighten it up with that vise or with a clamp if you're clamping it to the table. And now we can make sure that our piece is going to stay nice and still when we hit it with the angle grinder. The next thing that I need to do is give my angle grinder power. So this is corded, so I need to plug it in. One thing to always be sure of before you plug in or stick a battery in your angle grinder is that it's facing up. You don't want it to accidentally turn on when it's facing down, because it'll start walking across the surface or come hurt you, right? So you want to make sure it's facing up with nothing on the trigger. You don't want to have that trigger pressed down by anything. You don't want it to accidentally turn on when you plug it in. So we're going to grab our extension cord, and I'm going to go ahead and plug in the angle grinder. At this point, you want to make sure that you're going to put hearing protection in and get a face shield. And if there's other people around you in the shop, you might suggest that they put hearing protection in as well, because this is going to be pretty loud. Okay, now that I'm nice and safe, I want to take a look at my angle grinder. And I can see here that the handle is on the left-hand side. One of the nice things about angle grinders is that these handles you can move. So you can unscrew the handle and you can screw it in on the other side if it better fits your use to have the handle on this side. For what I'm doing, I'm fine with this being on the left-hand side for me. And I'm going to make sure that this guard is in a place that's good to protect what I want to protect from sparks. So if you're not sure where the sparks are going to land, you can do a quick test with the angle grinder. Anytime you're using an angle grinder, just like lots of other equipment in this shop, you want to make sure that it gets up to speed before you touch it on the material. So you don't want to put it on the material and then turn it on. You want to turn it on before it touches the material. You also want to make sure that things like cords and your shirt or dangly items are near or not near the head of the machine here. So you can see that there's a little safety switch on this angle grinder. So I'll need to push that in before I can squeeze the paddle to turn the machine on. So I'll demonstrate what that looks like. You can see that it has a lot of torque and it'll actually move your hands, right? So nice firm grip on this is very important. It also is going to turn off immediately when you stop squeezing this paddle, so you'll need to have that paddle squeezed the entire time that you want to grind. So what I'm going to do is just quickly see where my sparks are going to land. So I'm just going to turn it on and grind a little bit on my material, and we'll see where the sparks go. So you can see that my sparks are shooting right out the top of the guard there. So if I was worried about someone working across the shop, what I could do is go ahead and adjust the guard to block the top half of the wheel if I didn't want my sparks to shoot that way, or I could change my approach to the piece. So I could move this way, and now my sparks are going to shoot over here instead of across the whole shop. So what I can do now is I'm going to go ahead and start grinding a little bit more, and you want to keep it nice and flat to the surface. You don't want to try and get in at a perpendicular angle. You want to be pretty parallel to your workpiece. And you also want to make sure that you're moving back and forth along your piece, because you want to make sure that there's even wear on the disc. The other thing that's important about angle grinders is you want to make sure that the blades or the disc stops spinning before you set it down. And again, you want to set it down disc side up. You can see that it takes a long time for that disc to slow down, so even though I'm not powering the machine on, if I set it down, that disc might still be spinning and it could move on your work table or even cut its own cord. So now you can see I can loosen up my vise here. Going in the wrong direction. Loosen up your vise, and you can see I've gotten a nice beveled edge with that abrasive grinding disc right there. This will generally be pretty hot if you've been grinding on it, so you can see I'm keeping my fingers away from where I was grinding. And you always want to make sure before you pick up a random piece of metal in this shop that you do a heat test before you grab it, right? This is pretty hot, but looking at it, I couldn't tell that it's hot. So if you see a piece of metal laying on a table, someone may have been grinding on it for 20 minutes before you got there. So a good way to tell if something's hot without just touching it and burning yourself is to hover over it with the back of your hand. And if you feel heat coming off of it, it's probably too hot for you to touch with your bare hands. So what you can do instead is either leave it for about 5 minutes, or you can grab some pliers or something like that, or some leather gloves, and you'll be able to grab it and pick it up without burning yourself. Now, depending on what you're doing with an angle grinder, you may find that gloves can be helpful. They can get really vibrating in your hands, and your material can get pretty hot. Important to remember that here in the metal shop, the only gloves you can wear to handle hot metal are leather gloves. Synthetic gloves will melt, and cotton gloves can actually just get a hole burned right through them, so they're not robust enough to handle metal. The only gloves you can use when you're using an angle grinder are these nice thick leather gloves. They're kept in the welding area, and if you can't find them, just go ahead and ask a shop tech. So you could use this to hold on to your angle grinder for you. You just want to make sure that whenever you're using gloves, you're being really careful about it, and you aren't getting them close to any moving pieces of your angle grinder. When you're finished with the angle grinder, go ahead and put it away, wrap the cord up, or return the battery to the charger. Stick the angle grinder back in the wall here, and any kind of accessories or discs that you may have had extra, go ahead and put them back too. If you did use shared PPE, go ahead and use the disinfecting station at the front of the shop to make sure you disinfect that so that other people can use it after you. It's also a good idea to go ahead and clean up the floor. If you were doing a lot of grinding and generated a lot of dust, sweep the floor and sweep off any tabletops so that you can make sure that area is nice and clean for people. If you did use an extension cord as well, go ahead and wrap that up unless someone else is using it. Wrap it up, unplug it. Let's talk about the portable bandsaw. This is a really good tool for making quick, dry cuts. It's not the best at making really precise cuts though, so if you need an exact cut, choose a different tool. The first thing that you'll notice is that this is a cordless tool. So I'm going to show you some features of it with the battery off, and anytime you're looking at anything or adjusting stuff on the machine, you want to make sure that there's no battery in it. So if we look at the machine, you can see that the back of it's actually open. So the way that you hold this is very important, because if you're holding it while it's running with this side towards you, it's really easy to get your shirt or something else caught in it. So you always want to make sure that you're holding it with those exposed parts away from you. Now you'll also see that there is a directional arrow and a certain way that this machine will operate in the way that the band goes. So this band is going to basically go down this way, which means that it's going to want to pull this surface towards any material that you're cutting. So it's a good idea when you start cutting with this that you rest the surface against your material, otherwise it's going to pull you there anyway. So now, before you are able to start cutting with this machine, you want to make sure that you clamp your piece or fix it in some way, again, unless it's something that's really heavy that you know isn't going to move while you're cutting it. Something like this though, I'm either going to want to clamp it in this vise or clamp it down to the table. So I'm going to go ahead and put this piece in my vise, and I'm going to leave the part that I want to cut sticking out because I don't want to accidentally cut my vise. So give it a nice tighten. And I'm going to go ahead and cut this part that I drilled right off with this bandsaw. It's also a good idea to wear hearing protection with this tool. It's not super loud, but it can get really squeaky. So hearing protection is a good idea. And again, eye protection is a must. I'm going to go ahead and put my battery into it. And when you do that, you want to make sure that you're not touching the trigger at all. So now that my battery is in, you can see that I can turn the machine on. And there is a lock mechanism, so if this button's in, it actually won't let you pull the trigger. So you'll have to push that button to be able to operate the machine. Now you'll also see that there is an LED light that turns on. So that's going to give you a good way to light up your piece before you start cutting. And if you remember, you want to make sure that you're holding those wheel parts away from you. And I'm going to go ahead and put this surface up against my material. And I'm going to let the weight of the saw do the bulk of the cut for me. So you want to make sure that you turn the machine on before you come in contact with your material. You don't want to have the blade resting on your material and then turn it on. The other thing that this LED light's going to do is it's going to create a shadow right where that cut is going to happen. So if you see there's actually a shadow on my workpiece that shows me where that cut's going to go. So that can be really helpful if you're trying to line up your cut with this machine. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to keep that surface right on my material, and I'm going to turn it on before cutting, or before coming in contact with my material. Once your cut's finished, go ahead and let go of the trigger so that the bandsaw can stop moving. Always remember that when you cut stuff, it's generally hot, so make sure that you're feeling before you go ahead and grab it full on with your hands. And remember that you'll usually get a burr with this machine. So you'll see that there's a nice burr right on here, but we can take this over to an angle grinder or a belt or disc sander and clean up that burr right away. But it is pretty sharp, so make sure you're not touching it. Once you finish with that bandsaw, go ahead and take the battery back out, put it on a charger, and return it to the storage over there so that it's in the same spot for other people who are looking for it. There are some materials here in the shop that you can purchase directly from OpenWorks. We've got long storage over here, and then we also have some sheet good storage over there next to the sandblaster. There are lots of places within Baltimore that you can actually buy sheet and metal stock. So if you don't want to buy it directly from OpenWorks, there's other ways for you to get it. One thing to note is if it does have a sign on it that says it's reserved, don't take that material. And if you're just looking for stuff to practice on, you can always check the scrap bins by the front door of the metal shop, and you can grab some scrap out of there to practice with. Just make sure you're checking to see what type of material it is so that you know the properties that you're working with and you're not using it in a way that might hurt you.